Welcome to Open Matters, an interview series designed to explore the intersection of open source and open standards with folks in our industry. I'm your host, Guy Martin, the Executive Director of OASIS Open. We've covered cybersecurity before on the show, but today I wanted to dive even deeper into the concepts of intersectional risk, trust, and transparency as they relate to the cybersecurity landscape. Specifically, how much is riding on us getting cybersecurity right, and what steps should we be taking to get just beyond talking about this and actually start making significant progress. Joining me today is Josh Corman, who's had a distinguished career in cybersecurity, with his most recent post being the Chief Strategist for the CISA COVID Task Force. Josh, thanks for joining us on the show. And if our pre-show briefing was any indication, I think we're in for a fascinating conversation.
I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome, thanks. So to start off, can you give our viewers and listeners a quick overview of the concept of intersectional risk and its relationship to the larger cybersecurity puzzle?
Yeah, wow. Term I take for granted every day now, but I usually have to unpack it a little bit. So backing up, in addition to my day jobs, I also about almost 9 years ago started a group of volunteer hackers trying to save lives through security research called IamTheCavalry.org. It was in recognition that the cavalry isn't coming, that no one was going to save us on issues where I had deep concern about wherever bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. So sometimes I call it cyber safety, but my general belief, even before I Am the Cavalry, my rugged software manifesto, is that if you zoom out, our dependence on connected technology is growing faster than our ability to secure it. And this includes areas affecting public safety, national security, economic security, human life at scale. And when I was first raising this, I think people viewed this as maybe a privacy issue. Like, I might lose my credit card, I might lose some healthcare info. But I meant this is going to increasingly affect public safety, human life at scale. And if you situate ourselves over the last 18 months, I just finished up that public service at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency as an emergency hire for the pandemic. Outside the scope of just the hospitals, if you look at critical infrastructure, the lifeline services that society depends upon, the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we have had successful cyber attacks on the water we drink, the food we put on our table, the oil and gas that fuel our cars and our homes, the schools our kids go to, the timely availability of patient care during a pandemic with life and death consequences, the municipalities who run our towns and our cities, the federal agencies charged with national security secrets, and so on. Stuff's on fire. And part of the reason we're allowing packets from the internet to affect the functioning of critical infrastructure is because we want the promise of connectivity, and we haven't really factored in the peril. So we want to balance the promise and the peril of connected digital infrastructure. At the moment, we're prey, and predators have increasingly taken notice. So when I talk about intersectional risk, I was brought into the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, but we very quickly realized that on a pandemic, it's such a massively multidisciplinary set of problems that we assembled a massively multidisciplinary team. Some of these emergency hires, including infectious disease experts, physicians, supply chain experts, IT, OT, or operational technology and industrial control systems experts, hackers with mohawks. We had a really diverse team of skills. And just like forming the Avengers, you needed everybody's superpowers working together to identify and buy down risk. So sometimes this was a cybersecurity exposure for a small, unguarded supply chain biomanufacturer for the vaccines themselves, so we can get people saved from the pandemic. Sometimes this was us identifying insufficient dry ice to keep cold things cold throughout the cold chain and cold storage for Pfizer or Moderna. So this intersectional risk concept is that you have to look at the interconnectedness and what are the constraints that can lead to adverse impacts and outcomes for the public. And that requires us to understand elective attack surface, elective exposure, elective complexity, where we have information, where we're blind, and things that I think a lot of cybersecurity and software people take for granted have actually contributed in material ways to disruptions of lifeline services and even to the loss of life.
Right. It strikes me as you talk about this that, yeah, you're right, that I think software people, and I count myself still as a software engineer, don't always think about the larger consequences of the systems that we build. And I know there's been a lot of talk around sort of the computer ethics piece of this, but you listed some examples, but are there things that software developers should really be thinking about that, hey, what are the potential life and death consequences of this thing that I'm writing? Because you may think you're writing, something for a cloud service and how that can't possibly affect, a life or death situation, but it ends up, through the interconnectedness you mentioned, ends up becoming an issue. So how do you think we educate software and standards professionals about the consequences that can come from the work that they're doing?
Well, it's no single thing. And years and years and years ago, when I was looking at the Agile Manifesto, now over 20 years old, I was ranting a bit because I read it and I could see how transformative it was for the profession and how it created a value set and a creed, almost like a Hippocratic oath. Mm-hmm. But it was missing any sort of acknowledgement of risk or attackers or adversaries or consequences. So some colleagues and I rewrote a rugged software manifesto. It's very short, but it has lines in it like, I recognize my code will be attacked by talented and persistent adversaries who threaten our physical, economic, and national security. There's a line in there for the developer truths of, I recognize my code will be used in ways it was not designed for longer than intended, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what's been missing is, like Simon Sinek says, start with why. We don't really have a clear pathos or a creed or an ethic for software developers. In one of my co-authors, David Rice, we talk about, sometimes we refer to software development as engineering, right? Software engineering architectures. But sometimes we think about it more creatively, like it's an art. Mm-hmm. And ultimately what we came down to is it's art with engineering consequences. Wow. And we haven't really resolved that. The closest thing I could find to a pathos, in Silicon Valley was Reid Hoffman saying, if you're not embarrassed by your product the day you shipped it, you waited too long. Or Zuckerberg, go fast and break things, which might include, democracies, and it might include, an attitude of, well, minimum viable product may be okay for low consequence software, but it's not okay when you're talking about medical devices or oil and gas pipelines or water treatment facilities. And ultimately, I think that the trust we place upon digital infrastructure should be proportional to how trustworthy and transparent that infrastructure is, and to the consequences we will incur if that trust is misplaced. So we have placed our dependence much faster, as I say, than our ability to depend upon it. And I think that's revealing itself. And we're going to have to start with understanding the awesome responsibility that comes with being a creator of digital infrastructure.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fantastic answer. I think it's going to be interesting, I think, from the educational standpoint, because all of those things make sense hearing you talk about it. And as someone who's read the Agile Manifesto, now I've got to go read this because I think it's fantastic. Getting software developers, and I think even more importantly, decision makers and policy makers to read these things, understand these things, internalize these things, is going to be kind of a continuing challenge. And do you see? I mean, obviously, you were hired for the pandemic effort. Do you think the pandemic is actually finally causing us to maybe, all of us professionals, to maybe look at this in a different light and think about, like you said, the consequences and the amount of trust we have to place dependent upon kind of where we are?
I think light dawns gradually over the whole, right? There's not going to be a single moment where everyone gets it. The reason I spoke to values first is, like, we could tell you how to fix things, what to fix and how to fix it. But unless there's a motivation to do so, incentives, carrots, sticks, et cetera, or ideally intrinsic, like, I want my code to be tested. I want it to hold up against adversaries. I want it to be trustworthy. Right. Then all the instruction in the world won't matter. So we've also been working since then through I Am the Cavalry and other things on trying to bend public policy and incentives. For years, I've been saying transparency is coming. I know we're going to get to SBomb and software bill of materials, but I take a lot of these fire prevention, hygiene, building codes for building code, to quote somebody from DHS a long time ago. I steal a lot of these concepts from Deming. Like, look at all the Agile and DevOps and CI/CD and Six Sigma and TQM. Like, software world and IT has liberally been inspired by and stolen from Deming and Toyota supply chains from the 40s. The one thing we never took was supply chain principles. He had three little principles that he didn't do them to make less hackable cars or safer cars. He did them to make more profitable manufacturing. And now it's baked into almost every manufacturing of goods or food or technology. And essentially, the extracted principles I've been screaming about for, I think, 8 or 9 years now is you should use fewer and better suppliers of parts. You should use the highest quality supply from those high quality suppliers. And you should track which parts go where throughout manufacturing so that when something goes wrong, you have a targeted, prompt, and agile response. Right. And these were done to save millions of dollars to have higher quality cars. And some of these principles baked into those overall systems of thought and process made them one of the most dominant and profitable automakers in the world for 40 years. Right. It saved the Japanese economy, those principles. So I'm trying to take proven supply chain techniques and apply them to modern software development, because we too have a supply chain. We just don't treat it like one.
Right. Yeah.
So
exactly.
But to your point about the pandemic, I would say some people needed proof, right? I still think we looked at this as a privacy issue in healthcare. I said, I love my privacy. I'd like to be allowed to enjoy it. But through my work in the pandemic, we now have the first statistical proof that ransom attacks can lead to loss of life. So I'm hoping that while it's really bad and heavy news, and while we're seeing disruptions to food supply and oil and gas and water treatment facilities, that maybe we're more grounded and more resolved to finally do the uncomfortable things that we've been putting off. So the good news is we've identified some methods, and now we have more political will than ever before. I think everyone's really, really tired and exhausted from the pandemic. But in the aftermath, I'm hoping we can finally roll up our sleeves and balance the trust and trustworthiness.
Cool. Well, I mean, it's a perfect segue. You mentioned software bill of materials, SBomb, right? And I know all of our listeners probably have either heard this term in news articles or, because it was included in the recent presidential executive order, which I know you had a little bit of a hand in helping with. But you talked about SBomb isn't new as a concept, right? It's based in Deming. It's based in all of these things. In our pre-show brief, you talked a little bit about the 5 stages of SBomb grief. I'd love for you to kind of dive into that for our listeners, to give them some perspective of why this is important and how we can utilize the 5 stages of grief maybe to get to a better spot.
Yeah, I'll reframe it a little bit, especially if people haven't heard what SBomb is. So SBomb is software bill of materials. It just builds on the idea of a bill of materials, which is a staple and treasured aspect of almost every other part of manufacturing. The idea is it's a list of ingredients of all the third-party open source components used in the construction, an dependency graph, ideally, of these. So they admit to degrees of specificity, but for years I've been trying to push this. There was a bill in 2014, Cyber Supply Chain Management and Transparency Act. Industry hated it and tried to kill it with fire. I later introduced it in a congressional task force report for healthcare industry cybersecurity after a single Java flaw and a single JBoss library and a single device in a hospital took out Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital for a week. They had to divert ambulances to other facilities, cancel surgeries, move critical care patients. And Congress liked that suggestion. I said we should have a machine readable list of ingredients of software for medical equipment. And upon seeing that, industry freaked out a second time and said, wait a second, if the FDA comes up with minimum requirements for an SBomb for medical devices, we might have an accidental de facto standard for everything that's ill-fitting. So there was a grand bargain, and Commerce Department assigned it to the national NTIA. Under Alan Friedman, we completed a 3-year voluntary best practice set of working groups where I co-chaired some of those. And the idea was, if we can come up with a generic best practices. Would the FDA use it? And they said yes. So we kind of harmonized. But in parallel, there were more and more and more cases of why this was necessary. There was an Urgent 11 flaw that people thought was in one piece of software. It was actually much deeper in the supply chain, affecting more real-time operating systems. There was REPL 20. There were other ones that just kept reminding us that this idea is overdue. And ultimately, after the SolarWinds attacks and others, which arguably maybe wouldn't even been benefited from an SBomb, the notion that we need much more trustworthy, transparent digital infrastructure kind of came to the fore. And now this thing's crossing the chasm, because for any federal procurement, critical software needs to have a machine-readable SBomb. The NTIA process came up with the minimum defined SBomb. And these are things that are readily available and can be thrown off by any modern software build chain. It can be a free byproduct of your Jenkins, just by building software at build time. It's harder for older stuff. So to get to your question, though, whether it's 5 stages or not, I really need to write a whole talk on this. But there's a repeatable process most people go through. I also like to quote William Gibson here that the future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. SBombs have been used for many, many years in financial services and other software companies for the internal software they write, because it's just so efficient. They save millions of dollars in unplanned, unscheduled rework, and they've cut down elective complexity, and the performance of the microservices are better. So it's just the right thing to do. I think what's new is the idea of exchanging them across legal and boundaries and organizational boundaries. And that required us to have standards and open standards and some sort of common denominator. So with those, I think what's happening is these new attacks, including the most recent Log4j, have really just punctuated its time, its overtime. And whether it's for everyone or it's really just becomes a market requirement, the federal government saying they want to receive these means that if you want to sell there, you're probably going to do something. And we're going to go from terrible, incomplete SBombs to slightly less incomplete ones to, very reliable ones. But there's going to be a growth curve. The way I put it, if you're a Game of Thrones fan, is just like they say, winter is coming. I've been saying transparency is coming. And organizations that were afraid of it initially have had many years to kind of clean up some of their sins. Right. But the oversimplified journey is usually it's like, I have no idea what's in our software. It would be too hard to find out. And then you see there's lots of readily available tools to fingerprint or build these. And then they have a shock and awe where they're like, oh my God, that's in there? I had no idea how much open source I used or how old and how vulnerable it is. And then they want to hide it, right? And then So then they try to say, oh, we should only do one hop, or oh, this is proprietary, or oh, doesn't this create a roadmap for the attackers? And all these normal good faith, mostly good faith, some not, objections, and they want to hide because transparency reveals that we all have some skeletons in our closets. But then there's some sort of acceptance phase where you realize, all right, everybody poops. We didn't know better. But you're going to be less judged on the prior supply chain spring cleanup you need to do and more on what you do about it going forward. And people tend to find it's an 80-20 rule. Most of the old, obsolete libraries just rolling forward to a new, fresher API compatible version is fine, or very minimal effort. And some of them are going to be really, really hard. Refactored APIs, rewrites, maybe you're going to have to live with it until that product is end of life. And that's the acceptance kind of phase. And you roll up your sleeves, you do the hard work, and you just make commitments. And your commitments will be judged to others in similar positions in your performance and your customer demand. Higher assurance software is going to need more rigor. Lower assurance might get more forgiveness. But we're going to go from opacity to some transparency with some ugly truths, just to the point where I think when people really fully internalize this, we're going to realize, why are we using so much code? Why do we have so many elective libraries? Why are we using unmaintained libraries instead of better maintained libraries? Why do we need a kitchen sink project that's a monolith when we can use something more stack and better maintained? And I think the eventual truth is we'll end up where Deming started, of fewer and better open source projects that are using the freshest of ingredients from those fewer open source ones. So maintaining a level of hygiene and vigilance. And then when something goes wrong, prompt and agile identification. You can tell in minutes or hours instead of days or weeks which of your hospital equipment might be using that vulnerable log4j. So it really doesn't eliminate software risk. No one thinks we're ever going to have perfect code, but the ability to have impact analysis of am I affected, where am I affected, is going to be fantastic in the transition. But ultimately, what we're going to end up with is fewer total lines of code from fewer projects, from better projects, and a little bit of a thinning of the herd for just using anything and everything, because it becomes easier and more elegant to have less complexity.
Right. I mean, and I think the interesting thing in all of that you mentioned, we talked about the carrot and the stick element of this, but a huge carrot that you sort of you didn't bury the lead, but it was in there, is that this actually is going to make, when we get to this point that you're talking about, it's going to make things more profitable. It's going to make businesses able to actually do more with, as you said, less code that is ultimately better. So I think that's the thing I don't want the industry to sort of lose track of is, yes, it's grief right now. And like you said, the different stages of where people are at. But, if we can finally get to a point that you're talking about, in the end, it actually makes business sense to do this.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I see a lot of things happening that we don't always, we sometimes come at it from the doom and gloom, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there's obviously huge issues here, but reframing it sometimes as this is actually going to make you more profitable, business person. I think sometimes having that discussion is a little bit easier.
Yeah, but I mean, just think about how we both just said that. We looked at this as the business efficiency, quality improvements, money savings on unplanned, unscheduled work as a gratis or a bonus. Most of the adoption of things like SBomb, I was the CTO at Sonatype for years. I didn't sell this as a security thing. I said, how'd you like to reclaim unplanned, unscheduled work and developer productivity? And for large organizations, financial services, we would save them several $1 million a year in unplanned, unscheduled work and downtime, in faster mean time to identify and recover for their service delivery. One of the CISOs I worked with, he made a bet with his engineering leadership. And he said, hey, we're using 16 different logging frameworks. Can we just pick the top 3? It can't be, efficient. A different one of the largest software producers in the world in financial services, they were using 81 versions of Spring concurrently. There were only 86 at the time. So the argument was, what if we use just fewer total versions? We called that, I can't remember the phrase we used for that, surface area or something like that. And then for a different one, we said, do you need every logging framework, or can we just standardize on, for new projects, here's the 3 we care about? And that way you could pick up a developer from this project and move them to that project much more easily. He bet he can get a 15% developer productivity boost. He ended up having a 30% developer productivity boost. And I said, how did you pick 15%? And he said, I made it up. But But these are real. These are the central reasons people adopted Deming principles. The security was a collateral benefit. I didn't want to go around hitting people with a security stick. I just think that because of the security failures, it's dominated the SBomb conversation. But businesses exist to be on time, on budget, sometimes with acceptable risk. I think there's many good reasons to do this beyond the security benefits.
Right. Agreed. So shifting gears a little bit, and I usually ask this of most of our guests, what role do you believe organizations like OASIS and others play in this, not in the cybersecurity space, but in the making businesses more efficient space, especially because there's, as you noted, a huge diversity of stakeholders involved?
Well, back to that line of the future is here, already just not evenly distributed. Huge swaths of this space wait until there's standards and adoption and open interchange. So the role of these become very important to scale adoption and consistency. We have some benefits in that we kept these SBomb specifications quite elegant and quite simple. There's a few formats that support the minimum viable SBomb. Most notably is SPDX, Cyclone DX, and to some extent SWID. They're translatable amongst each other, so we have some good fortune and good luck here that we're not asking for a lot of things. But as these open systems and open standards become more part of a larger ecosystem, it's important that they can interplay with other things as well. So one of the branches and sequels to SBomb, and I usually articulate this in 3 columns. There's the SBomb, which is just the facts, just what's in it, right? The ingredients, project name, the version, some hash. There's a minimum standard. People usually jump to column 2 or 3 prematurely, and they say, well, if you know what's in it, you can map that to potentially exploitable vulnerabilities. And the middle column is kind of dangerous because maybe out of 100 known vulnerabilities, only 10% of them are exploitable. So people call them false positive. They say, no, they're potentially exploitable. You can remediate them by rolling forward to the least vulnerable version, or do it at whatever risk-based timeline you want. But column 3 is where it gets interesting, which is sometimes called VEX. I still hate the name and the acronym, but it's Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. And it's when the vendor or the software provider makes an attestation that says, for these potentially exploitable vulnerabilities, we are not vulnerable, or a patch is coming here. So that VEX thing is now a lot of the people that want it sooner than the rest of the market is ready for. They're using one of the OASIS standards, CSAF. So these types of things only make adoption and interplay more robust, and it plugs it in. So this is that common security advisory framework, fairly new. But if you can also make vulnerability attestations against an SBomb, great, more power to you. And there's other ones like DBomb is coming up. It's essentially think of it as the shipping manifest for provenance and chain of custody. And other artifacts and build information, including but not limited to an SBomb. And there are other standards from other groups. MUD is manufacturer usage description. We can see that MUD could maybe point IoT device to a URL where they could fetch the SBomb. So there's a whole ecosystem that's going to have to come into play here, and the investments that you and your colleagues make this less scary, more consistent, and predictable for software providers, either from commercial or open source sectors.
Cool. Thanks. So we're almost out of time here. I'd like to kind of end on a little bit of a looking forward piece, and give you an opportunity to both talk about what still keeps you up at night when you look into these issues of intersectional risk and cybersecurity, and then also what you feel is potentially positive. Maybe end on a positive note of where you think we've made some great strides and can make some in the future.
Yeah, I always hate this question.
Sorry.
I recently encountered someone who inverts it and says, instead of what keeps you up at night, what gets you up in the morning, what gets you out of bed. And
right.
We'll do a little both, I guess. I mean, what gets me out of bed in the morning is I want to save lives. And I think, as the world increasingly depends on software and digital infrastructure, they increasingly depend on us, right? Those who produce software, those who do, software security, risk management, and we have some evolution to make. So whether I'm doing fire prevention and building codes like SBomb or software development lifecycle, or encouraging the rise of the chief product security officer, or whether we're doing firefighting, like, successful hacks of hospitals during a pandemic, contributing to loss of life. Those are the things that kind of keep me up at night. And it's not theoretical. I don't know if you saw this, but there was a front page story about a lawsuit for a loss of a baby after birth in Alabama. The hospital had been ransomed, and the family is suing because there were exchanges between doctors and nurses saying that if they had access to their imaging technology, they would have made different choices and the baby would have survived. So that's likely going to be case or precedent or settled, that it's going to be hard to ignore now that if we already know delays can affect mortality rates, and cyber attacks can introduce delays and inefficiencies. So we knew this conceptually, but on top of that, my team at the CISA COVID Task Force, we published something on October 1st in a document about provide medical cares in critical condition. We were able to study the effects of ransomware on states hit hardest by ransom attacks during the pandemic. And in the same state with the same population, adjusting for hospital type and size, we could see that hospitals hit by ransom in their towns were hit these excess death stress levels faster and stay there longer than their peer group. So we can quantify a loss of life exacerbated by cyber disruption. And when you zoom out, some of these are phishing attacks or whatnot, but some of them are log4j flaws in medical devices. Some of them are hard-coded passwords that really shouldn't be there. Some of them are unnecessary elective attack surface or unsupported software in service to national critical functions. And we are upside down on our mortgage. So we talk about our bridges and tunnels collapsing, our digital infrastructure is collapsing. So what concerns me is it's going to take years and years. The predators are here and stuff's on fire, but it's going to take years and years in political will and effort to make this trust we place on digital infrastructure more proportional to how trustworthy it is. The silver lining for me is that now that we are coming to grips and reckoning with the consequences of this dependence on digital infrastructure, perhaps this is the Bill Gates trustworthy computing memo moment. Like, what's the trustworthy computing memo for critical infrastructure? And maybe you have to hit rock bottom. You got to get sick and tired of being sick and tired. Yeah. Maybe we're there, and maybe this can be the turning point for us to get these things in a better balance. And as people are ready, we have cheerful warriors willing and able to help you get there faster.
Cool. And I know you're one of them. Thanks so much for that, Josh. And, thank you for joining me today. And as I predicted at the top, I think this has been a fascinating discussion, not just diving into cybersecurity, but really, as you touched on, the important societal ramifications of what's going on out there and the things that we depend on. I really appreciate the work that you've put into this and the thinking you've put into it throughout your career. So thanks for sharing that with us today.
Thank you.
Awesome. So, folks, if you want to learn more about our cybersecurity work or other OASIS projects, you can find us at oasis-open.org. And let's continue this conversation on Twitter. We're at OASIS Open. Once again, until next time, thanks everybody for listening.